Hello and welcome to today's event. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many of you here, both in person and online. My name is Anna Bedard and I work in the exhibitions team here. I am a white woman and I have brown hair and I'm wearing a dark blue top. My pronouns are she, her. For those of you not familiar with us, Wellcome Collection is a free museum and library that aims to challenge how we all think and feel about health. And it does that by connecting science, medicine, life and art. We are part of Wellcome, which is a global charitable foundation that supports science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone today. Tonight's event has been inspired by research for an exhibition on the subject of milk that will be opening at Wellcome Collection in March 2023. Milk is an extraordinarily complex and contradictory substance. It's used as a symbol of the primal and the natural, even while it's become an incredibly processed foodstuff, industrially produced on a global scale. Milk is something that many of us really do take for granted, but I think it's that everydayness that hides the reality of its position at the heart of health and economics, of global politics, and of our relationship with the land. As milk is separated from the body, it becomes inseparable from bodily politics. Lactating bodies, human and non-human, are subject to processes of regulation and control. Milk's long-standing associations with purity and whiteness mean it has been used as a tool of empire and nationalism, and as a symbol of racial discrimination. The event tonight at Wellcome Collection is an opportunity for us to start a discussion around the subject of milk, with our incredible panellists joining us tonight, and with you, our audiences, here in person and online. We would really love you to share your thoughts, your questions with us, and you can do that either via the cards on your seats, in person during tonight's Q&A, or if you're online, you can do so via the online chat on YouTube or via Slido. Subhadra will go through all this again, and Andrea will post in the online chat. For those who would like to ask a question in person, please do be aware that we do have cameras here for live streaming the discussion. So just bear in mind that the online audience can hear you. And I'm told that the cameras will only be able to see the backs of your heads. I'm not sure whether that's more reassuring or less reassuring. And lastly, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel after the event. So all that leaves now is for me to hand you over to our facilitator for the evening, writer, broadcaster, and curator, Subhadra Das.
Good evening, everyone. How lovely to see you. My name is Subhadra Das. We are all audio describing ourselves. So I am a middle-aged South Asian woman who is very excited to be out of the house. And also suddenly really paranoid that the lipstick that I'm wearing for the first time in a very long time is sticking to my teeth. So we're friends now. So just don't hold that against me. It's lovely to be here. And it's lovely to see all of you. I use she, her pronouns. I'm getting used to this. And again, thank you for bearing with me. As Anna has very nicely described for us, we're going to be talking today about the subject of milk, its associations with purity and whiteness, and the racialized politics of diet and nutrition. Hopefully you had some indication that this was going to be the area we were going to be exploring. Otherwise, this might come as an interesting shock to you. But also, I can guarantee you, based on the panel we have here, an education as well. Long held to be the cornerstone of good nutrition, milk is entangled with histories of nationalism, empire, and food inequality. What can a closer look at milk tell us about the ideas and the forces that have shaped our global food systems? Now, the most important people in the room are you all in the audience who are in the room, and also the many people who are joining us online as well. So some of the things I want to get before we start with the discussion of this evening, I want to make sure that everyone knows about how things are working. Gravity's still working fine as well, which is good. Now, So this is a live in-person event at the Wellcome Collection, so well done for those of you who made it. And the event is also being live streamed and will be available to watch again on the Wellcome Collection's YouTube channel. For those of you who are joining us online, hello. Your cameras and microphones are switched off, but hopefully you can see and hear us. We have live speech to text provided by VoiceBox. This is always, you should be able to see that behind. Oh, you can be able to see it here, the other behind me. It's coming. You should also be able to see that on the live stream or access the link via the chat box now, and it opens up in a separate window. It's always very strange because you're the people I can see. This is no use to any of you, but it's useful to other people, so thank you for your patience. This event is British Sign Language interpreted. Our interpreters, Sumaya and Joe, will be taking it in turns to interpret what is being discussed and put that into British Sign Language. We will be audio describing this event. The host and speakers will describe themselves and key visual elements they refer to. Something to do with schedule, so the event altogether, if I do my job correctly, will be an hour and a half long. Each speaker is going to offer some comments and a provocation to familiarize you with their research, about 5 or 10 minutes. It won't be longer than 10 minutes. Good. We're going to have a conversation between ourselves, and then we're going to open it up to questions in the room and beyond. That's the last 30 minutes. So be thinking. As I said, you are all the most important people in the room, so we're interested to hear the questions that you have and the thoughts that you have. I will remind you, just in case, because I'm academically trained, so this is my experience. The thing you're trying to avoid is me, when you have spoken, asking the question, is there a question there? Is everyone on board with that? Good. I can't see it being a problem, but you can never tell. Right, this is an interactive element, and as I said, we'll be starting the questions from the audience at 8 o'clock. For those of you who would like to and you're here in person, please raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you. If for whatever reason you'd rather not do that, you'll see that you've got cards and pencils, so feel free to write down your questions and hand them over to, who am I handing them over to? They're coming to you, are they? Yes. Here's Natalie, who's holding up her hand at the back of the room. Please hand your questions across to her and she will bring them to us. You do need to be signed into YouTube to ask questions on the chat there. You can also ask questions and comments without signing in via Slido. I don't know what that is. I'm assuming that people who are using it know what that is. I'm middle-aged, as I said. And there's a link in the code to use in the chat. A safe space. Now, obviously, we want for this to be a positive experience for everyone involved, and we want to create a place that is safe for people to share their ideas, so please interact in person and online responsibly and respectfully. You are encouraged to participate in Wellcome Collections events, but are requested to be respectful of other participants, speakers and performers, all to be respectful of each other. And not to use any language that is inappropriate, defamatory, abusive, obscene, racist, discriminatory, and otherwise inflammatory remarks. That's a bit of a downer. No one was going to do that, were you? You all look like lovely people, and I'm sure that is definitely the case online. If anyone has any issues and you're online struggling with the platform, please comment in the chat box or Slido, and Wellcome Collection moderators will get in touch and be able to help. So that is the housekeeping. I realize it goes on for a bit, but it's important because you are the most important people in the room and we want you to be able to participate. Now, as we go on it's my job to introduce you to our amazing panel of speakers. You need to know a little bit about me before we go on with that, which is that I am a historian of race science and eugenics. We're going to be talking a lot about the idea of race. And there was one little story that I just wanted to start with, because milk and race is an interesting combination. The people who are on stage with me know much more about it than I do. But there was one little story that I was reminded of in the preparation for this evening. It's a court judgment that was handed down in a United States court in the 1920s, where the judge said that the defendant is one of a gang of robbers who operates in Franklin County, that during the whole of its worthless career has been an ungrateful customer of valuable provender, and that the defendant is an unworthy father of progeny. The defendant in this particular case was a bull who had been brought into the dock. He was a scrub bull, which I'm informed is a bull that is the offspring of non-pedigree cattle. And this particular case was a showcase with a bull as a defendant at a farm show, many of them happening in the US in the 1920s, that was part of the eugenics movement. You may be familiar with the Fitter and Beautiful Baby shows that also happened in the US at the same time. Fitter families, beautiful babies, criminal cows who were not of the appropriate pedigree, who were eating the food and being a drain on the resources, and altogether being a metaphor for the people that eugenicists believe to be a drain on US society. It's quite shocking. It was supposed to be fun. Apparently, this was like a fancy show trial. The court gave its decision. The bullock was then systematically slaughtered, and the event finished with a barbecue. For any vegetarians in the room, I can only apologize. But also, the eugenics of this is shocking. And this is just one of the many ways in which the ideas to do with food, to do with the food economy, and to do with products, I am aware. I am grown up in the city. I am an urban person. I am aware that the milk doesn't come from the bulls. I do know that. But I think it's just interesting that this is one of the things in which we kind of come across in the wider scope of all the things we're talking about. I'm already doing a bad job with the talking and keeping hold of the time. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speakers for the evening. I'm going to introduce you to each of them all together so you know who they are. So first we have Johanna Zetterstrom-Sharp, Fosia Ismail, and Andrea Freeman. I'll be introducing you to them in more detail as they give their presentations. And so first up is Johanna. Johanna is Senior Curator of Anthropology at the Horniman Museums and Gardens and Lecturer in Anthropology at Goldsmiths University in London. I used to work in museums. I don't know how she does both of those at the same time. So we are very grateful that you share some of that time with us, and you're going to be talking about some things here. So I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Subhadra.
Pleasure.
And I love that bullock story because a really important part of the relationship between colonialism and dairy is the importation of dairy breeds onto the African continent, for example. And there's lots of really interesting stuff about the relationship between indigenous cattle breeds and those that are imported, so we can talk about that later. So I'm just going to audio describe myself. So I'm a white woman, I'm unusually tall, and I'm wearing a kind of jazzy Harlequin silk shirt. Thank you for having me. I want to begin by quoting the opening sentences of a chapter in the history of UNICEF that was published in 1986 to mark the United Nations Children's Fund's 40th anniversary. The chapter is revealingly titled, "Civilization Follows the Cow." And I quote, "In the UNICEF mind, the virtues of milk could be no more questioned than the virtues of motherhood. In the eyes of both beneficiaries and supporters, UNICEF remained for many years a kind of gigantic organizational udder, distributing a daily cup of safe, hygienic, nourishing milk to as many children in the world as possible." The chapter goes on to describe a vast program of milk distribution in the 1950s and 60s, focusing in particular on the African continent, as well as what the organization termed milk conservation, which included the supply of industrial milk processing equipment to regions which already had a thriving milk culture, but were not considered to produce milk in sufficient volumes, nor to the standards of hygiene that could be achieved through industrial pasteurization, air drying, or, for example, ultra-heat treatment, UHT. Like many mid-century international aid organizations, UNICEF relied on colonial infrastructures to distribute its milk products and equipment. These infrastructures are physical, missionary maternity clinics, colonial military barracks, agricultural schools founded by British academics, roads and railways. But what interests me is that these infrastructures are also about the ways in which organizations like UNICEF created knowledge about and imagined the needs and capacities of the people they sought to improve the lives of, and the legacies of this today. UNICEF's self-identification as a giant udder associated milk with everyday milk drinking, hygiene and nutrition, as well as milk as a universal need. And these dominate the global discourse around milk through, for example, the International Dairy Federation, feeding into the way that the milk industry today is subsidized and milk products are circulated. So in the 1950s and 60s, US milk subsidies for dairy farmers were so high that the milk industry produced a huge milk surplus. It was this surplus that was processed into dried milk and purchased by UNICEF for global distribution. And Andrea is going to tell us, I'm sure, about more of the ways in which US dairy surplus continues to shape food oppression today. Milk offers a really useful lens for understanding the ways in which colonialism, as European entitlement to take and transform land and govern its populations, was justified and given legitimacy through the idea that particular groups of people needed scientific and technological guidance and aid, not only to live well, but to survive. And particular landscapes, plants and animals demanded intensive and mechanized human intervention in order to be useful and productive. UNICEF has been described by historian John Knotts as a milk pusher, reflecting how Northern European obsessions with milk and animal protein more generally enabled the continuation and justification of a narrative that populations in colonized nations did not understand how to feed themselves and needed. Milk aid was a way of ensuring that wider structural inequalities present as a result of colonial policy, for example, increasing pressure to abandon existing foodways, to shift towards intensive agriculture, impacted on the availability of food and the time required to prepare it. It enabled the focus to shift towards the idea of education and aid, and thus an imagining of populations as both unable to understand their own nutritional needs and resolve them. Essentially, milk was one of the ways in which the West has been able to maintain its old colonial ways, further embedding inequalities and drive environmental destruction, whilst feeling good about it at the same time. UNICEF's self-definition as the world's udder highlights how the dominant global discourse around milk has always focused on increasing both the demand for milk by educating people about milk's nutritional value and at the same time growing volumes of milk that can be produced. And this is built on an assumption that not only is milk a vital part of any healthy human diet, but it's also the most natural way to consume it in large volumes. And in order to achieve this volume, milk has become a vastly mechanized industry involving the vast transformation of landscapes that were not created or that are not suitable for sustaining the large dairy breeds that are required to reduce the volumes of milk in order to meet that imagined demand. So this assumption, whether explicitly or implicitly, is obviously may be understood as a white supremacist one. Essentially that Northern European needs and the science and technology devised to address them are the needs that pertain to and are most important for global majority populations. The title of the chapter that I began with, Civilization Follows the Cow, is indicative of the way in which drinking more milk has been conceived of in progressive terms. So these Northern European needs have also been understood as the needs that come with ever-increasing civilization. One way in which this intersects with the relationship between milk and colonialism is the procedure for taking and owning land. For example, in 17th century Western Australia, land ownership for white British settlers was predicated on the ownership of livestock, including lactating animals such as cows and goats. And this was built on the racist cultural evolutionist idea that Aboriginal Australian communities did not use the land, nor did they have the intellectual and technological capacity to exploit the land to its full potential. Upon arriving to Western Australia, the amount of land settlers were given title to was dependent upon the number of livestock they were able to procure on arrival to bring with them. In North America, this was extended to cattle loans, whereby settlers were able to borrow and breed heifers in order to build their own dairy herd and secure land, with loan payments made in milk and butter. So high was the demand for dairy cattle in the 17th century that the Dutch West India Company agreed to transport cows for free, which is quite extraordinary, thinking about the Dutch West India Company as an enormous capitalist enterprise. This relationship between white settlers as dairy drinkers and legitimate owners and landowners runs deep. And it's not only an early colonial settler one. So in the 1950s and 60s, around the same time UNICEF was forcefully distributing US dairy surplus to mothers on the African continent, archives from the Food and Agricultural Association, World Dairy Congress and International Dairy Federation indicate the obsession with growing the dairy industry in Eastern and Southern Africa, and how despite there being a long history of milk consumption and trade, they were only interested in supporting the expansion of milk production of white settlers. African milkways, including specialised understanding of cattle health, the importance of sharing milk with young calves to ensure regular supply, and a detailed understanding of the ways in which the nutritional composition of milk changes in relation to the age of the calf, were discarded as unscientific and wasteful. Additionally, technologies for processing milk, making it safe to drink, such as fermentation, the use of charcoal, were considered unhygienic and dangerous, and milk producers were subject to extensive regulation. This was also a period of intensive importation of northern European cattle breeds, such as Friesians and Jersey cows, given that such cows had been bred to produce much larger volumes of milk than local breeds. They had also been bred to be sustained on a diet of fresh grass, and many archives in this area focus on how to sustain cows on a diet of fresh grass in an environment that doesn't support it. So how to irrigate, use aerial spraying of pesticides, how to enclose land and erect borders to keep others out. I'm going to stop there because I think I've run out of time.
Okay, that's very organised.
But I've got plenty more to say, so thank you very much.
That's wonderful. We will definitely come back to that, and thanks for being mindful. I really appreciate it. Okay, next. Fosia, it's your turn. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Fosia Ismail. She is a scholar, a cook, and a founder of Arawello Eats. Apologies if I mispronounced that. I should have asked you before that. A platform for exploring politics, identity, and colonialism, all of our favourite things, through East African food. She has worked with a range of cultural institutions on exploring food and empire, and she's appeared on my personal favourite, the BBC's food programme, BBC's Radio 4 food programme. So she's famous. We're lucky to have her here. And she's also part of the Dakhan Collective.
Yeah.
So close, but so far. A Somali feminist art collective in Bristol. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Fosia. I'm a very tired Somali woman. I cooked for 200 people yesterday at the watershed, so you'll have to excuse me. Wearing a grey dress and curly hair, purple lipstick. Okay. That was really interesting. It would be really great to have a discussion later. What I'm going to do is focus on camel milk. So what's really interesting, so Somali people drink camel milk. So cattle has not really been a part of our culture. And so I've got an image for you. So here is a recipe that my mum did, which was an alternative recipe. The image is of a wooden carved camel. You have on a white table, you've got a glass of kind of a bubbly looking milk, and then you've got this weaved object, the hag, which is like a really good. Basically, that is what when you're milking a camel, that's what would go on your knee, and so because the camel's so tall. I'm going to read a little bit of an extract from my paper, which is talking about this kind of association of camel and this funny alternative milk that Somali people across the diaspora used to do, which is made of yogurt, Sprite, water, and salt. It's amazing. It's really interesting that was what the alternative for camel milk was. If landscape is a way of seeing that we learn, I see a Somaliland that is inextricably linked with England. I learnt to make hawash in England, and yet it is also a reminder of home, or at least of a landscape that is not English. When we as a family go for walks in the beautiful English countryside around Bristol, I always take a flask of shah, or chai. I grew up drinking shah, the tea my mother made for guests. My boys now associate country walks with shah, as does my English husband. It is the only time I make it. I think there's something beautiful in this, a Somali trace of spiced tea in the rural English landscape. T.S. Eliot articulates the complexities of this migration well. The migrations of modern times have transplanted themselves according to some social, religious, economic, or political determination, or a peculiar mixture of these. There has therefore been something in the removements, this is why I'm tired, analogous in nature to a religious schism. The people have taken with them only a part of the total culture. The culture which develops on the new soil must therefore be bafflingly alike and different from the parent culture. Wherever people migrate, there will always be gaps in the availability of foodstuffs, some seemingly essential items that cannot be transported or do not grow well in the new environment. For my mother, who grew up as a goat herder on the Ethiopian-Somali border, fresh camel milk has a strong association with the Somali landscape. Since leaving Somaliland, this camel milk has become for her imbued with mystical powers. Camels are so important to sustaining Somali nomads that there are 46 different words for camel. My mother firmly believes fresh camel milk cures all sorts of ailments, and she laments its loss. The loss is far greater than just camel milk. It is a loss of home, a loss so keenly felt that my mother, along with a generation of her peers, took up this recipe for camel milk, consisting of these unlikely ingredients of 7-Up, natural yogurt, salt and water. Imagine our excitement every Ramadan when she would make us this camel milk. For children of the African diaspora, the idea of home or this parent culture is entwined with food. If culture began when the raw got cooked, the making of eating and of food becomes much more than nourishment. In a foreign land or in a hostile and racist world, it becomes a safety net for your identity, a space where you can simply exist and recharge this sense of you as a human outside of the white gaze. When you leave this safety net, you again become defined by your otherness. As I write this paper, I'm aware of the famine that is devastating East Africa. I'm aware because we are always aware of what is happening back home and do what we can to help. We are connected. My mother's sister is still a nomadic goat herder, like many others, and has seen her flock and way of life devastated. I've struggled to reconcile this reality with running an East African supper club. It seems indulgent and wrong to be commodifying Somali food here, while the very people who have inspired the food are struggling. We live in a time of political uncertainty. The recent vote to leave, this was written in 2017, and it's unbelievable to me how it's still relevant now. There's another famine and drought that's happening in East Africa. So we live in a time of political uncertainty. The recent vote to leave Britain, to leave the EU was rooted in this idea of empire. The making Britain great again is a form of nostalgia, a longing for a past that makes people like me. Against such uncertainty, I'm finding solace in food. The setting up of Arowello Eats has been in some ways a response to a gap in the food scene, in others an outlet for my own nostalgia for Somaliland, a land I never lived in but which frames so much of my world through its wonderful people and cuisine. I hope it will frame my children's world too. Somali spiced tea fits well in the English landscape. So the context for me mentioning the famine is this, camel milk. The reason why camels are so important to Somali people is we are entwined. Like the Somali people could not have survived in the kind of very arid climate. And we adapted. And not only did we adapt, it's actually such an essential part of our culture. So from the weaving objects to the amount of camel songs that you get. So what's happening with climate change and this is really, it's all of the intangible cultural heritage that's lost of nomadic life. And so I'm going to leave you with this song. These are some elders that I worked with. A lot of them were nomadic before they came here. And this was a song, like a love letter to, it's almost a love song for the camel. And there are so many songs like that. There's work songs, there's, and I think the amazing thing about Somali nomadic pastoralists are the fact that they have being self-sufficient essentially, and the British colonialists and European hated them because of this kind of their love of the camel, and their different relationship to milk, to not being bordered, and being free, and the camel was a real essential part of that freedom. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. And thank you for the honesty of that. I think that's probably not a single person in this room and beyond who hasn't been affected by that, so thank you. Also, just to inject a teeny bit of lightness, I'm mindful of the fact that yogurt, Sprite, water and salt is probably the most offensive thing we're going to hear today. So the fact that you did that and then came back in with T.S. Eliot as well, I was like, because let us always remember T.S. Eliot, an anagram of toilets. Now, these things are complicated, you'll forgive me. I just wanted to, because I'm on the verge of tears listening to you, so I just wanted to lighten that a little bit. Before introducing you to our last panelist, Dr. Andrea Freeman, who is Professor of Law and Carl Smith Ball Faculty Scholar, fancy, at the University of Hawaii William S. Richardson School of Law. She's also a Fulbright Scholar at King's College London. Couple of books to her name, one forthcoming. We'll be hearing more about that shortly. She writes and researches at the intersection of critical race theory and food policy, health and consumer credit, with a special interest in the whiteness of milk. She's my new favorite academic. So thank you so much.
I hope I can keep that title for a while.
At least the next
5 minutes, 10 minutes?
No, hour. We've got an hour. It's good.
All right. Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm very excited to be here with these incredible people. My name, as you said, is Andrea Freeman. My pronouns are she and they. I am white. I have long, messy brown hair, and I have a black top with silver studs and purple trainers, you would call them? Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. So, although it's surprising to some people, but not this audience tonight, see, there. The link between milk and white supremacy is what we might think of as an open secret. It's there for anyone who is looking to find it. So here is a mayoral candidate and actor Lawrence Fox, who used a milk emoji as a symbol of white supremacy in his Twitter name, following in the footsteps of Richard Spencer, who invented the term alt-right, and Baked Alaska, who took part in the January 6th Capitol riots. These are neo-Nazis who crashed an anti-Trump installation, chugging jugs of milk, letting it dribble down their bare chests, and saying that they had an anti-vegan agenda. Milk has long been associated with Nazis, and here we see it's a scene from the Quentin Tarantino movie. It says, "Heil milk, heil cows, heil our people's lactose tolerance." Okay. This is a person, presumably female, being given a foot milk bath with a large swastika in the background. And here is another association of Aryans and milk, and this one is from History of Agriculture in the state of New York. This is from the movie Get Out, an excellent film if anyone has not seen it yet, where a white supremacist divides her milk and her Fruit Loops to retain the milk's purity. These are some white supremacist message boards with a poem, "Roses are red, Barack is half black. If you can't drink milk, you have to go back." I'm being generous calling that a poem. And here's, another sort of bigger image of the map that has lactase hotspots showing where in the world people can have the greatest tolerance for milk. And this is lactose intolerance by race. It's in the US. So really, what it shows is that only Northern European and Scandinavian adults can really tolerate milk, and almost every other group is primarily not able to digest it. This is a list of other harms that are associated with drinking milk, like heart disease, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, multiple sclerosis, high cholesterol, cognitive decline, early death. And in all of these, there are racial disparities, which I'm not showing, but trust me, I could show you later. So knowing of the racially disproportionate harms that milk has on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and BAME communities, what's more surprising than white supremacists' embrace of it is the government's efforts to support the dairy industry and push its product on the communities that it harms the most. So I'm going to talk about US government cheese. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter vowed to increase the price of milk to 6 cents a gallon. To do this, the government bought surplus milk, but it couldn't store that milk for very long, so it bought cheese. And after every cold storage in the United States was filled with cheese, the government rented half of an acre in a Kansas cave and filled it from floor to ceiling. Eventually, the United States had 2 pounds of stored cheese for every one of its residents. And so, as was already mentioned, the government sent milk to people in other countries, but they couldn't transport cheese. So instead, they had the brilliant idea of delivering it to poor neighborhoods, a plan that wouldn't affect the price of milk because the people who received it wouldn't have been able to buy it otherwise. So rappers like Kendrick Lamar and Jay-Z have measured their success by their distance from government cheese. There's also, Okay, this is an image of In Living Color, which is an old comedy show in the US where they spoofed the government cheese. So bringing large quantities of cheese into Black and brown communities made the racial disparities in the milk-related conditions, illnesses, and deaths that I showed you even worse. The US government also sent commodity cheese to indigenous communities through the Food Distribution Program for Indian reservations. And this program was developed to help the government get rid of the surplus commodities that were created by subsidies in the US Farm Bill. And it continues a long tradition of creating conditions of starvation and deprivation for indigenous people, and then in compensation, offering them rations that then sicken them. This is an image of a mountain of buffalo skulls. And scholar Dana Vantries writes about how popular commodity cheese is across indigenous communities. A quiz titled How to Tell If You're Rezzed Out has a question: every time you see a line, you jump in thinking that you're getting surplus cheese. Musician Wade Fernandez, who's a member of the Menominee tribe, sings Commodity Cheese Blues. I went downtown to the commod shop, met the blues because they were out of stock. Tell me cheese, please, when I'll get my commod cheese. And Visa cheese is a mode of exchange in which a block of commodity cheese can purchase other goods or services. A 2006 Indian Country Today article observed, quote, some Lakota still say to this day that the only brick of gold the Lakota people got out of the Black Hills is the brick of cheese rationed out on Commodity Day. Now, the USDA also sends milk to public schools. This is an image from the Special Milk Program. Public schools are disproportionately attended by students of color who are also overrepresented in the school meals programs. And on top of giving milk directly to public school students and counting pizza as a vegetable for the purposes of schools following the federal dietary guidelines, these are some comics that came out in response to that decision, the USDA uses public schools as marketing sites. And here's a pizza on the side of a school bus. The USDA's marketing branch, which is called Dairy Marketing Inc., works with fast food companies to increase the amount of cheese in their products. So they got McDonald's to switch from margarine to butter. They created the Domino's 7 cheese, American Legends pizza product, and gave away a lot of pizza through the Jimmy Kimmel Show. DMI has also partnered with the NFL to create Gen Youth, which has an app that lets kids earn points to become an ambassador at a student summit where they get to meet NFL players. And they get points by doing activities like making cheese and making milkshakes and going around collecting coins in milk jugs to give to food banks so that a food bank can buy milk. And in 2019, 81% of the kids who are eligible for free lunch, who are disproportionately students of color, participated in this Gen Youth program. The USDA also gives milk to over half of the infants in the United States in formula through the WIC program. Mothers of color disproportionately participate in WIC, and the mothers that participate are much less likely to breastfeed their children. And now, if you've heard, these babies are facing the prospect of having no food at all because of the infant shortage in the United States. The government also gave out milk to food insecure people during the pandemic, although other food has been scarce. This is an image of how milk and whiteness are linked together in milk advertising. And I'm closing with this image of a group that opposed Spike Lee's participation in the famous Got Milk campaign, which had celebrities with milk mustaches, that was also created by DMI.
Thank you. I'm used to this sort of stuff, and I still felt like that needed a content warning. So if everyone else takes a moment to breathe after everything that we've just been subjected to. And I remember those posters because I went to an American high school in the Middle East, and they were in the library. That was the place where they get milk. So in addition to getting your education, you can get your calcium too.
That's actually a myth.
I know. We're going to hold you. Because the calcium comes from where, Andrea?
What the cows eat.
Yeah.
The greens.
So we should just eat the grass.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Vegans get plenty of calcium. Stop having a go at the vegans. They have plenty of calcium. Could we have a quick round of applause for our panel? That was everything. And I didn't do anything to restrict the time because I was enjoying it far too much, which basically means instead of having 20 minutes worth of discussion between us, we're going to have 10, because I still want to make sure that the most important people in the room get to be a part of the conversation. There is a lot going on there. And I wonder because again, some of this is new to me and relatively recent. For me, the big issue here is the fact that in the United States, the way that the milk was used is kind of like a reverse Margaret Thatcher. Does everyone, there's not that much age disparity in the room. Do the younger people in the room understand Margaret Thatcher milk snatcher? Do we know what we're talking? Okay, yeah. So in the UK, the thing that the fascists did was to take the milk away.
Yes, I've been looking into this a lot recently, and I've been really fascinated by that difference as well. Because the way that milk got introduced into schools in the first place was actually very similar to in the United States. It was just designed to boost the dairy industry. There had been a trade deal that allowed imports from other countries that was depressing the demand for milk. And so there was this push to open up a market, a bigger market. And so that's how we got milk in schools, even though in the first iterations of the milk program, the milk was really bad. It made people sick, it wasn't screened, it was never really a healthy program, but there became a shift in the national consciousness or view of milk, so that by the time Thatcher took it away, it was something that people really felt entitled to, and that they wanted, even though they had rejected it at first.
Yeah, this is the state that we're at politically in this country, is we now have to earn our government's contempt rather than just have it inflicted upon us. And I'm wondering, like, we've got, there's a bit of a continental divide. We've got the Atlantic sort of halfway in the middle of the stage there. How are the British people looking at this picture and thinking about how it reflects with food in this country? Can you eat your way home, or is it ringing bells? Like,
I think it's interesting to see, in the context of climate change, that you've got on the one hand this kind of really an attitude to consumption and entitlement to food with no awareness of the impact it has on the global south. And that's what I find interesting.
Yeah, this idea of environmental racism. Right?
Yeah, just the fact that, you know, you've got, that they've created, everything's so capitalistically driven. It's so driven by this kind of relentless market, this idea that economics works in this way, that I think it's really interesting to step back, and that's why I'm really attuned to nomadic ways of existing or thinking about how do we learn from indigenous communities who are at the forefront of this. And even with milk uses, like, so with camel milk, you know, you've got fermented camel milk. There's different ways of making it and storing it without refrigeration. There's different ways of, you know, so that's come out of a need, you know, for those people. But it's just shocking to me that there's another major drought, and, you know, I don't know what they're expecting, 250,000, 300,000 children to die this year. And it's been exacerbated by Ukrainian politics. And this happened. I could not believe it's happening again. That was the shock for me. I dug out this old Oxford Food Symposium paper. I thought it's going to be relevant to this talk. And then again, there's a major famine. And so I think we have to really engage with the politics of capitalism, really, which drives this kind of crazy consumption of milk.
I mean, one thing that really interested me of your paper is that prior to pasteurization, which was all about stationary European urban populations needing access to safe milk. And so the only way to do that was by pasteurizing milk so that it could travel far. But the sort of the global majority milk narratives are about milk being an inherently mobile substance. So it travels incredibly well when it's in an udder.
Yes.
And it also can be processed using things that are to hand. So, for example, the use of charcoal is a really important way of dealing with E. coli, of cleaning the vessels that are used to ferment milk. And it's all things that can be, so gourds are used to ferment milk, which are things that can be grown, and charcoal are things that can be grown. But the sort of the Northern European capitalist obsession with growth is all about huge volumes of milk, which require expensive equipment, which means that milk corporations need to be funded often by external funders. In order to make those worthwhile, you need huge numbers of cattle, so you need huge tracts of land. The most productive cattle are imported cattle from Europe that are used to eating grass, so you also have to irrigate and you have to enclose. So the history of enclosure in East Africa is also very much bound in this enclosure of land in order to feed cattle. And there's some kind of crazy statistic, which is that 7% of the world's surface is used to grow food to feed cattle. And this is all about this stationary capitalist idea of milk. But milk isn't all about that, and I think it's really important to recognize that milk is actually an incredibly sustainable, mobile, nutritious way of kind of living in the world, which is, you know, can be very much at one with in terms of human and animal relationships. But the thing that interests me is how the model that now, for example, you know, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals are entirely tied up in is this one of pasteurization. And the subsidies that come out of that. You know, the US and the UK produce too much milk, and they don't know what to do with it. And so then you get these inequalities and, you know, deals with fast food outlets. So it's, yeah.
So bound up with the idea of and this is very pertinent to me. For those of you who don't know, I'm currently working on a book which is a critique of the idea of Western civilization. And I don't promise that this is the first and probably the last time that I'm going to mention it. It can come up again. But what I was learning about was Australian Aboriginal techniques of land management, which are hugely sophisticated ideas that go back 50,000 years to do with fire and the management of land. And the colonizers turn up and they say, this space is empty. There are no people here. Nothing is happening here. And the result is these cows being shipped in, and then the environmental disaster. So one of our previous disasters at the beginning of 2020, you'll remember, is horrendous bushfires roving the continent of Australia. If the original land management had been in place, that definitely would not have been happening. And I just wonder, Fosia, can you speak a bit to that in terms of
absolutely. I think when you look at I've been really involved with the art project that I've been working with. We work with elders, and the ingenious ways in which people but basically this idea of this being dirty, or this idea, it's racialized. It's kind of to do with empire. It's to do with this idea that there's no knowledge. And I think what's interesting about indigenous communities all over the world, and this is something that keeps coming up, they really understand how to live with the environments that they have, how to respect what they have. So, for example, I'll give you in other parts of Africa they use gourds. In Somalia it's so difficult because it's so arid. There's so much the tree. There's not enough. You don't have the ability to make a gourd, so you weave it out of grasses, and then you will use tree bark. And you just take a bit of the tree bark, and that goes into, it's the way in which Somali women make these objects that then go on to process milk using charcoal, using making their own vessels from what limited resources they have. I think it's so ingenious, and I think we have to kind of really look to that. To indigenous communities, because there's a lot to learn about also not wasting. So even with the way in which the camel is, all of the camel's used when it dies. So the tendons of the camel are used to make this really sophisticated rope, for tying to really sophisticated, really unbelievable levels of technology. That are made from the local environment. It's unbelievable. And the way in which, so for butter, in Roman times, actually subak, we make subak. Somalis, we would export subak to Rome. That was a commodity. We sold frankincense and butter. And the way in which Somali people process butter meant it lasted for months without spoiling. And they did this through boiling the milk, not camel milk. You wouldn't use camel milk because the fat, it's got different fats. You do sheep milk, and they would boil it, and then after the boiling, they use they would store it in these vessels that were burnt, that you would burn with, and and you can even see it in antiquity, but you could also have in the Egyptians would import our butter. So it was a big, pre-refrigeration. Somalis were pretty it's amazing. It's technology. So the idea that then you get this kind of obsession with refrigerating milk products, or this, for safety when it's, I guess, when you are moving. When you are stationary and you don't have that relationship to I think there's just a complete, capitalism has really driven so much terrible practices in agriculture and a lack of respect for the way indigenous communities around the world have actually lived sustainably. And when you look at stats, so a Somali person in 1 year uses up the same carbon footprint as one American person uses up in 4 days. you know, and so we have to start talking about, we have to really contextualize it within climate justice movements, and really how do we make this more equitable? It's unbelievable that then the people that are literally living in the most sustainable ways are the ones that are worst affected by this, and it's an absolute disgrace. And I'm really, you know, what's really exciting, I feel like, you know, we have to have hope. And for me, a lot of the work I do is really rooted in nomadic practices and trying to engage back. Because the other bit about it that is really sad is, say, that song that we did with elders. I mean, our elders are dying. So the songs are dying. The work songs, the poetry, it's dying. It's intangible cultural heritage. And I like to use the word climate genocide because that is what's being committed. You know, active climate genocide. And I think we have to engage with that. You know, that's what's happening.
Thank you. That's a lot, but also I can't disagree with you, because that's what the definition of that word is. And I'm going to reference, this may or may not be true, because I've just done that thing where I saw it on Twitter and I haven't actually looked to see whether it's real news. But did David Attenborough is going to be awarded a second knighthood? He's like Knight Squared. He's like Nighty McKnightface. And this, can we remember, is the man who on one of his TV programs suggested that the problem with the environmental crisis is to do with we need to now start controlling population in order to mitigate and avert the environmental crisis. I hope that it's very obvious to you from what you have heard on this panel that that is very much not the case, and that people who suffer from droughts don't happen by themselves, and the people who live in drought-ridden areas don't choose to live there for cultural reasons, right? This is not something that is done deliberately. So, yeah, there's a powerful words, environmental genocide, but I think they're pretty accurate. We've got a consensus happening on the panel. We all agree with each other, respectfully. We are open to questions and other points of view. Again, respectfully will be the thing that I remind you of. So if anyone in the room would like to ask a question personally, please do raise your hand and we will call on you. I can ask you the favour of waiting for the microphone. We're in a small room, but we're not the only people listening. So in order to make sure that you are heard, please do wait for the microphone to come to you. And I'll stop being quite so draconian about that and let's have a chat about it. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? Do we have any cards of anyone? Has everyone just been, it's all been gold, I will give you that. Like proper gold, not the cheese kind of gold. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought. Sorry, let's not do that. But yeah, has anyone? You knew all this already? I mean, wow. Okay, we have got a question over here. Can we get a mic across, please? Thank you.
Can you hear me?
It's just coming, I think.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello? Yes.
But can also speak up as well.
Okay, good. I'm quite
Very
quiet.
good.
Thank you all so much. Like the spectrum of milk in many ways. That's brilliant. I was kind of coming back to thinking about industrialised food, and the cost of food. And we know, looking at the moment, the cost of food is going up. I just had a quick Google. The cost of milk in the UK has gone up 27% since last year. Finally, maybe the farmers are getting paid. Who knows? But thinking then about alternatives, plant-based milk, which I guess is getting a bit of a drive because people are quite aware of the lactase and the environmental aspect. But then equally, the price of plant-based milk is very, very high. And side note, I'm a dietitian supporting people with diabetes, and not a lot of plant-based milk has iodine in, and actually that's pretty key. So check for your iodine if you are. So my question, getting there, thank you, is thinking about that milk still is effectively quite a cheap and nutritious thing. I appreciate that, and I know this in clinical practice, not everybody can have milk, but where do we go from there? Because it's getting expensive, people are hungry, and it is a nutritional thing. What's the alternative?
Okay, great question. Lots of parts to it. Can we? No, that was good, and that was also an excellent way to ask a question. I'm just going to share that with the room. It was very good. Yeah, there was preamble, there was context, and then there was a question. I didn't have to ask you whether there was a question. Part of that was to do with plant milk. Andrea, I'm going to come to you about the plant milk thing in terms of capitalism, because who's making the plant milk?
The dairy company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no escape, really, is there?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just so not convinced that milk has any beneficial properties that I don't see a need to find an alternative for it. Right. I mean, if you ask, well, what are we going to do if we can't drink milk because we're priced out of it? I'd say, let's have some rice and beans and water. You know, like I just don't see it as an essential part of the diet, but I know that a lot of people have grown up believing that it's necessary, and that if you know, you still have to have the cereal, so what are you going to pour in it, right? But I would just challenge us to think of other ways.
Could you just repeat that really quickly back into the mic?
So I'm just thinking about the variety of nutrition you can get from milk, and I appreciate what you're saying about, well, what does a cow eat? How good is the milk? Background of food policy. Anyway, so, but going back to that, it's the spectrum of nutrition that you can get in a milk, and then if you are on a budget, you have to really work hard to cook a lot, shop around a lot, and then the alternative is a lot of cognitive load and maybe financial too, to go and get the same nutrition somewhere else.
I think we might have because I'm also mindful that the respect goes both ways, and what we've got here is actually a really fundamental disagreement. We're not going to be able to solve this one here today, but I think it's a good illustration, really, of what we think to be fact and what we know to be true, and how those knowledges are constructed and who gets them. You're trying to help people get good nutrition. You're trying to shine a light on the superstructure of how all this is happening. There's a disconnect here, and that's a result of both of these things. So this is very much the kind of thing we're trying to work through. Do you two have anything you want to add to that at all?
I would just say it's really important to really link it back to power, in that where I don't want to shame any consumer. I don't think it's about the consumer at this end. If you can afford to have alternatives, great. But we've got, I mean, how many food banks have we got in this country? You know, so I think but the issue does come back to politics. Get the Tories out, basic, and I also think really we have to start looking at how our political systems are designed to entrench these kind of just harmful practices, and even things like gas going up. People, you know, I've worked with a lot of in very poor communities in London and Bristol, and when you realise, God, you know, people might not cook just because they are genuinely worried about gas equally. So I think there's an issue around poverty, basically, that, you know, but it's a really important point that you make about, you know, for people that can go alternative, it's worth it. I know my children, I still like a bit of dairy in my coffee, but my kids are oat milk. They would never have cow milk, you know, and I think that's a generational change. I feel like actually younger people are changing. I did a feast for 200 people. It was a vegan feast. That's what we're doing now. So I would never now cater not vegan. So you make your ethical choices where you can, but without shaming people.
Yeah.
Capitalism is the only way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I should just say, because the mic didn't pick it up, the words ahead of the word capitalism there was, we have to dismantle capitalism.
Yes.
Just
Yeah,
one more
not
time
capitalism
for the
is the
record.
only
Okay,
way.
good. Just checking. Have we got a question at the back? Yeah? Hi.
On? Can you hear me? Oh, great. We have a couple of questions from the people live streaming from
Excellent.
YouTube, which is great. So the first question I'll ask is, someone's asking, the charcoal used in milk, is it used to dye the milk black or grey?
Yes. I mean, that's such an interesting question about the colour of milk. Mm-hmm. So one always assumes that milk is white, right? But depending on how it's processed, the colour changes. One thing that's also really interesting in industrial pasteurization, milk from cows across a very large region is collected, mixed in a big container, and pasteurized at once. So but in many kind of global majority mobile milk practices, there's a much closer relationship between the cow and the calf and the location and the place. And depending on the age of the calf, the colour of the milk changes. And that, therefore, indicates a different nutritional composition of that milk. So, for example, early milk, first milk, has a very different nutritional composition to milk 3 months later. And as you know, mums who breastfed have known, milk is incredibly clever. And that's a knowledge that's lost. So, yes, charcoal does change the colour of milk. There was a huge amount of regulation against the use of charcoal in the sort of 50s and 60s, or attempts to regulate to make milk whiter. And just back to plant milk, one thing that really fascinates me about plant milk is that it's not the nutritional composition of the milk that's important, it's the colour and the taste that determines what is used to make milk. So even though the language around milk is often about nutrition, the substitutes are actually about colour, which kind of blows my mind.
Wow. I hope that was I enjoyed that reply. I hope that was good.
Hello?
Yeah, you there? Yeah.
Oh, I'm here. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was so great. And this leads into the next question that someone's asking. They've also commented that they love this panel. So thank you very much to all of you. And they're asking, looking at the color of milk, does the panel see the tactics of melding white supremacy to milk continuing in the nutrition and purity rhetoric of contemporary milk, such as oat, almond, pea, etc.?
Anyone? I'm trying to wrap my head around
I
the...
don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think there's some deep feeling of connection to the cow, and that the cow is central to that idea. But who knows? People are adaptable. Yeah.
It's also about the imagined idea of lactose intolerance, right?
Like the map.
Lactose persistence.
Yeah, so that that's what makes certain people special, right? Is that they can tolerate this when most people past childhood cannot. And so if they aren't able to distinguish themselves in that way,
that's one of the so it's one of the inherent biases in and racism inherent in Western medicine, is that the phrase is lactose intolerance, when the vast majority of people have the situation, they're the ones who are intolerant. I think the main thing probably to keep in mind is that racists are not very clever, but they do cotton on to the work of a lot of clever people, and this is where the danger lies, is because they look at the science, and some of the science is super outdated and super old, but a lot of it isn't. And I think I would just reminding people who are scientists, you have a responsibility to understand how your research is being used.
But that also goes to the idea of lactose persistence. So that is, there are a lot of studies that look at actually communities that drink milk that's locally produced digest lactose, so there's a kind of a biome going on there.
Makes
so
sense.
it's to do with, this idea of kind of who can and can't digest lactose is one that's entirely built around this kind of Northern European obsession of taking milk from 2 continents away in order to drink it, to open your fridge and have it like a tap. So it's really interesting. The science of lactose persistence is quite complicated.
And the way that you were describing the milk being kind of all put together and pasteurized in a vat, the thing that reminds me of is wine production for your 3-pound bottle of wine. And again, casting no shame on consumers, but that's the process whereby that is made. And olive oil. I did not know that one either. All the olive oils, the promiscuous as well as the virgin?
Yeah, so if you go to your
one of my own
Tesco or
jokes,
your Waitrose and you just buy olive oil, it's a massive collection of olive oils from all. It's not a pure.
Yeah. Even at Waitrose.
Sorry, even at Whole Foods.
Man. Okay. Just showing my colours there. It's such a welcoming ambience. Okay, sorry, we've gotten distracted. Do we have any more? It doesn't have to be about supermarkets. Do we have any more questions? Hello. Gentleman just here, can you wait? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. It's very interesting. I'd just like to go back to a comment you made about David Attenborough. Could you tell me why the rapidly growing world population is not a problem?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Unless I heard you wrong.
Oh, no. Yeah, okay. So, no, you didn't hear me incorrectly. The idea that the growing world population, in and of itself, as something that is happening in and of itself, is a problem, is what the problem is. The distribution of resources, of food, of pretty much everything on the planet is not uniform, and it is not just in the way that it works. And I'm not speaking to David Attenborough as an individual, but when he said what he said, that population is an issue, he was feeding into a century-old discourse, that the idea is that you have the wrong kind of people breeding out of control. This is the history of eugenics, and somehow the idea that it's the increasing quantity of the wrong kind of people. And if we think about the way in which we've been looking at this, as I said, people who live in drought-ridden areas don't choose to live there, and they don't choose to make droughts. They are the victims of a global system of capitalism and a history of empire that puts them in that situation. And a lot of the discourse around environmental control, and I'm saying this as the least Indian person you're ever going to meet, but an Indian nonetheless, is we have to look at per capita consumption. Yeah? Because when we say things like it's populations growing out of control, yes, I represent, there's 1 in 6 of us on this planet is Indian, 1 in 6 of us is Chinese. To suggest that that is where the problem lies solely, when we're looking at those carbon footprints, when we're looking at those issues of consumption, that's where the problem is. He can have all the knighthoods he wants, but he is a person in a position of huge influence, and he has to be careful about his rhetoric and how he uses it, because those people chugging milk, they agree with him. But I don't think they necessarily, I don't know whether he would agree with them in terms of solving that population problem. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a historical issue that we need.
I see what you're saying, but I mean, personally, I don't know the context in which he said it. So.
Oh, okay. It was a TV documentary.
Yeah. I don't. Did he address?
Yeah, he was talking about environment. As you know, he does nature programs, and so he's talking about the climate crisis, disappearing biomes, endangered species, in the context of the fact that the planet is burning. He was trying to bring attention to a really important topic. I'm just concerned about the direction he decided he wanted to go.
He didn't mention inequality of distribution.
No, none of that, I'm afraid.
And that's part of the problem, is that we've become very depoliticized, and there's a huge ignorance around how how economics works, and how it's still linked to colonialism, how it's still linked to this idea of this kind of consumption and luxury. For example, like the fact that people even the cars. When you look at cars, I'm always like these huge, great, big Range Rovers or Land Rovers in cities. Why? It makes no sense. It's just a status symbol. But this idea of choice being allowed at without any regard to what those choices mean. So who needs 500 different types of cereal in the supermarket? There's a real question about choice and consumption that we have to really engage with. And so the population thing is not, if one Somali person is using the carbon footprint in a year of what one American uses in 4 days, that's where the problem is. The American, or the British, or the Northern European. It's here. Yeah, so, yeah.
Idea of choice, right? Because there's this subset of the population that demands choice of everything, as you're saying. But then there is this false idea of choice where most people who are living in poverty or just living regularly aren't actually given any choices in what they consume, what they eat, what kind of cars, if they have a car at all. But we're still framed as though it's choice. And so that's opens the door to racism and other forms of blaming.
Yeah, these are all structures we're talking about, and often the way the solutions are framed puts the onus back on the individual. It's you need to make better nutritional choices. It's sometimes they aren't necessarily down to you as an individual. I appreciate the question. And I think the reason for it is because, we're used to this discourse. It's not part of the regular public discourse. It's not where the knighthoods get given out. But I appreciate the question. Thank you. Question over here. Can you wait for the mic? Thank you, guys. Yeah.
I just had a question around what does a decolonized diet look like? Or what does it... I know it's a big question.
4 minutes on the clock, I'm just going to say. It's an excellent question. What is a decolonized diet?
Oh, yeah.
You should have.
So I've been doing experiments in circular economies in Bristol. So, for example, there was this big feast and the Watershed, which is an arts, culture, cinema space, just sort of let me do it in how I wanted, which was beautiful. So we really engaged with the issues of environmental. We did a vegan feast. We did it with amazing women who have been affected by modern slavery. So these are women that have been rescued or newly arrived migrant women. There was an anti-slavery chocolate pot made with Tony's Chocolonely. It is the only chocolate you should really buy because there's so much slavery still in chocolate and child slavery at that. So it was a joyful feast. For all the heaviness, actually, it was beautiful. And what we've been trying to do, and the reason why I do food, I'm really interested in people engaging with interesting ways that are joyful to deal with impending climate collapse, because we have to do it in a joyful way for people to engage. And so the food was delicious. The kids, I got a primary school to make the welcome drink, which was made with elderflowers that were foraged locally. And so everything was really, people were blown away by the feast. They had a wonderful time. And so you can do it. There are choices that organizations, institutions make around their supply chain. They're around how we view food and consumption. And so to me, that's how you decolonize a kind of eating habits in a way. But it has to be through joy. Loads of people didn't miss the meat either. They were shocked. They were shocked.
Thank you.
I have a teeny technical question on that one, which is the insects. We should all be eating the insects until such a time as they become our overlords, and they'll hold us up for that. I'm not a vegan myself, so I don't know if this is presumably eating insects doesn't count as vegan. No, it probably doesn't. The vegans won't eat insects, no. But the rest of us who, if we're not vegan, that could be a choice that we all then again choose to make individually.
What's really interesting about the insect debate, it's been happening for years, hasn't it? This kind of, we're going to get insect burgers and we're going to do... You know what's really funny is it was an African vegan feast. There was not a processed pea protein thing in sight. It was just vegetables. Dudes, just use vegetables. Grain, like actual real food that, someone's grown on the ground.
There's a novel idea.
There's this obsession, though, with these alternative meat substitutes that actually then has an impact, again, on the global south. So it's like, eat locally where you can, grow your own veg if you can, support really amazing work. Riverford is fantastic, for example. That is a great veg box. They do so much amazing work around soil. They do, and they do work in Africa as well. And there's just it's fantastic. And actually, it's owned by I think the guy that set it up. It's been sold back, so the workers now own it. So support, where you can, kind of anti-capitalist. It's almost like capitalism but done good. Like there's a growth area. People want to support good businesses. So
Thank you for that. Fosia's woken up at the end here as well now, so it was a really good question. We've got 2 brand recommendations too, so thank you.
I love it. I like the good. I like the good brands.
Yeah, but the vegetables is easy. We can all do. Pizza is not a vegetable.
Pizza's not a vegetable.
Jacob Rees-Mogg may be a vegetable.
Here in the US, it is a vegetable.
In the US, it is a vegetable. Look, sometimes in my house as well. Yeah, that can occasionally happen. I'm afraid the time has done the thing that it does, which is that it has run away with us. So I'm not going to be taking any more questions from the audience, but please do feel free to use your cards to write other things, nice things, please. I think we've all got the vibe. If there's something else that you would like to contribute or have communicate with us. Folks on the panel, really quickly, is there anything that you thought you were coming here to talk about that you didn't get a chance to say? Are there any books that you're currently writing that you would like to plug to make sure that people buy them when the moment comes, and all of these sorts of things? So Andrea, can I start with you? Is there anything that you just like to put on the table really quickly and tell us about your book?
Okay, if you want to read about an incredible story about the famous Fultz quadruplets, who were the first black formula models and the first recorded black quadruplets in the United States, and how a white doctor named them after his relatives and sold them off in an auction to a formula company who made millions off of them and kept them in poverty all their lives until they all got breast cancer. But it's more fun than that. It's not just depressing. Then please pick up my book called Skimmed: Breastfeeding, Race, and Injustice. And look out next year for my book called Ruin Their Crops on the Ground, which traces the history of food oppression from colonization and enslavement, and the way that food has always been used to oppress and subordinate people up into the modern times.
Excellent. Good job. Thank you. Who wouldn't want to know that story? Thank you. Fosia, tell us about you. Have you written a book?
No. But I just encourage people to try and go out and pick elderflowers and make some elderflower cordial if you can. It's really easy, and it's out there for free in parks. So I know it's not milk related, but I just thought it's around right now, and it will go in a couple of weeks. So there you go. Sorry.
No, it's great.
Random tangent.
It's a great tip. I'm going to get her tag wrong, but there is a brilliant woman on Instagram. I think her tag is Black Forager, and she's based in the States, and she would concur with you on that one. She does all the cool, sugary, yummy things as well. Thank you. Last but not least, Johanna, is there anything you'd like to?
I haven't got a book,
Yes.
but I really want to write one.
Okay.
I'm quite new to this, so I'm actually a museum curator. I work at the Horniman in South London. And I was telling Subhadra earlier that this recent obsession with milk is a desperate ploy to get out of museums.
I advise.
And here I
recommend.
find myself in one. But I'm interested in anybody who's interested in the colonial history of milk, because I'm trying to write a funding bid. I'd love to write a book, and I'd love to speak to anybody who has anything to say, anything to add to the conversation, because I'm very kind of early on in this, and I can just see that it's absolutely huge. And I'd love to bring anybody along with me who's interested. So thank you.
That's very warm and welcoming. Thank you very much. I've had a great time. I don't really care whether you have, but I hope that you have, because I have enjoyed myself, and that is the important thing as far as I am concerned. But there's a couple of housekeeping things. So yes, do use the comment cards, and please be advised that as of 30 seconds from now, the welcome is closed. They told me to tell you that because they don't want you to hang around now because it is closed, and there are people who work here that have homes to go to. But they would want you to come back. And there's the exhibition is going to be opening next year, next March. Okay, so keep an eye out for that. And that is all. That's all she wrote, actually. So it only leaves me to thank our amazing panel: Johanna Zetterstrom-Sharp, Fosia Ismail, Andrea Freeman. Thank you so much. This was such good fun.